So why do we have 4 Gospels instead of just one? And which is the best Gospel for you to read? Well, each of the Gospels was written by a different person to a different group of people for a very specific purpose. And so each Gospel is shaped differently to meet that purpose. It's a bit like if you want to catch the news about something that's happening around the world. You might watch a TV news channel, or go to Facebook or TikTok, or listen to a podcast about it. And each of these media outlets will report on the same story but from a different perspective, each for a different purpose. And it's the same with the Gospels. When the Gospels were written, there was loads of information out there about Jesus. His stories and parables, information about his birth, life and death, eyewitness accounts of his healings and miracles. And so the Gospel writers took the stories that would be most useful for them to persuade their own audiences about the truth of who Jesus was. So let's take a brief look at each of the Gospels. We start with Mark because that was the first Gospel written. Mark's Gospel was written to a primarily Roman audience. So how was he going to convince a Roman that Jesus was the Son of God? Well, he wrote a short Gospel, fast moving and to the point, and omitted all the things that a Roman really wouldn't be interested in. So there's no mention of Jesus' Jewish heritage. There's no mention of the Nativity, the birth of Jesus. There's not much from Jesus' sermons. There's hardly any references to the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures. Instead, Mark focuses on Jesus' healings and miracles and the way in which he controlled nature and raised people from the dead. Mark wanted to convince his Roman audience by Jesus' actions more than his words. Read Mark's Gospel and you'll get the basic facts of Jesus' life presented in a passionate and energetic way that will inspire you in your faith. But what about Matthew's Gospel? Matthew was Jewish and was writing his Gospel for a mainly Jewish audience, and he wanted to convince his Jewish readers that Jesus was the Messiah they'd been waiting for, the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. So Matthew draws on more Old Testament references than either Mark, Luke or John. There are between 350 and 500 prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament, and Matthew mentions loads of them and makes many other allusions as well to prove that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Knowing where Jesus came from and the context of his ministry helps us to get a deeper insight into the Messiah who we are following with our lives today. And Matthew's Gospel will give you that insight. Okay, let's turn to Luke's Gospel. Luke wasn't Jewish. He was the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. And Luke's Gospel focuses on reaching Gentiles, not Jews. During Jesus' ministry, he was in contact on a daily basis with people who good Jews were considered to be outcasts. Lepers, prostitutes, sinners, tax collectors, Samaritans. And Luke wanted to write a gospel to the Gentiles that proved God's love to the outcasts. So he includes the parable of the prodigal son who lived a wayward life. He included the story of the prostitute who washed Jesus' feet with tears. He included the story of Zacchaeus, the hated tax collector. We read about Jesus' contact with lepers and those on the margins of society, showing that the love of God goes beyond the bounds of social norms and that he reaches out to everyone. And that includes you and me, because we have let God down so badly, and yet Jesus reaches out to us and meets us with his grace, compassion and forgiveness. And finally, we have the Gospel of John, and his Gospel is really different from the others. Mark wrote his Gospel first, and Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark's Gospel, because a lot of Mark's material appears in Matthew and Luke as well. But John's Gospel is out on its own, and over 90% of his material doesn't appear in any other Gospel at all. John was writing his Gospel to a Gentile audience, and he wanted to prove that Jesus was God. And John takes a much more philosophical approach than the other Gospels. He doesn't focus so much on the history of Jesus' life. Instead, he uses stories and sayings attributed to Jesus to build a complex and beautiful philosophical portrait about Jesus. The 7 signs of Jesus, the 7 I am sayings of Jesus, and more. It's a powerful piece of writing that expounds on the eternal nature of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, that will take you deeper into the heart of God. So if you were to read one gospel today, which is the best one to choose? Well, it depends what you're looking for. If you want a fast-moving story about the life of Jesus, then read Mark. If you want to understand more about Jesus within his Jewish heritage, then read Matthew. If you want to be assured that Jesus reaches out to you despite your sins, despite your failings, then read Luke. If you want your mind stretched by a deeper philosophical portrayal of Jesus, then read John. Wherever you're at in your faith today, however you want to engage with Jesus, there's a gospel for you just waiting to be read.